So our second speakers today are Ben Morgan, Assistant Director at the RFPB, and also Richard Watt, who chairs the RFPB London panel. So Ben and Richard are now going to give us more detail on the new application process. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you, David. So my name is Ben Morgan and I'm the Assistant Director of the RFPB programme. And as David mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit more about the detail of the changes of the programme while we change. I think David highlighted quite a few problems that the programme's perhaps had in the past, so I'll try and explain how these changes address those problems. So just a bit basic about the programme. So David mentioned quite a bit already, but one of the things we talk about later is the funding tiers. So we have 3 funding tiers, and I'll talk a bit more about the detail about that later. But this is quite a new thing, so some will be familiar with it, and perhaps some of you won't. Also, I thought I'd give you a bit of background about the programme, where it is to date. So we're currently up to competition 28, so we've run quite a few already. And based on the previous 27, we're up to 700 projects, which we funded in the past, and £160 million worth of research. So as David mentioned, it's a high-volume, small-scale, so our NIHR's small project funder, if you like. And in terms of the success rate overall, so again, probably one of the things which wasn't mentioned earlier, but one of the feedback we hear is that the programme's hard to get money from. 22% success rate is probably about in line with other programmes, if not a little bit higher. And London in particular actually has slightly higher than average success rate, so about 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5. As you submit, providing you get to peer review. So that's really the context in which we're starting these changes from. So the guidance, so as mentioned, this is new. So the funding limit of the programme is £350,000. And within that, there's a couple of sub-tiers. So really, the programme's view is we're invest money into research that's likely to have a structured patient benefit. How far the research is to patient benefit will determine the amount of money we will put into it. So if it's upstream, further on the pathway to patient benefit, we would invest a smaller amount of money, whereas if it's likely to have an initial straight outcome to patient benefit, then we're happy to invest a bit more in money into that. 350, a good example would be something like a full trial, fully powered trial. That's likely to give you a clear answer to a question. That's good, close to patient benefit. That's the top tier. Feasibility studies, which we actually see quite a few of, they're the step further removed, aren't they? Because at the end of a feasibility study, you're probably thinking about putting in a full trial or not, depending on the outcome. So that in itself doesn't lead to patient benefit, and therefore the money we're willing to invest in that is slightly reduced at £250,000. This is a soft limit, so it can be more if it's well argued. In my experience, they're not very well argued, so I'd always advise you try and stick to within the £250,000. Otherwise, it's usually one of two outcomes. The application is rejected and the feedback is it's poor value for money, or it's funded and the conditional feedback is get the cost down to $250, so you don't really escape the funding tier anyway. And perhaps more interestingly is the third tier, the £150,000. We call it higher risk. It sounds like it's questionable ethics research or dangerous research. It's nothing of the sort. It's basically higher risk from achieving patient benefit. And this is a new tier, which in the past, if we had received applications for this type of research, it would have gone out on scope because it would have been too far up the research pathway. And this has been implemented for the last couple of competitions. Excuse me. These are the types of research topics which we would suggest might fall within this type of funding tier. This isn't an exhaustive list, so there may be other things, but ultimately these are the types of things we see in the programme and what we'd expect to be costed at no more than £150,000. Probably 2 of the more common types we see are developing and refining interventions and developing new scales. And if you think of it, you may develop an intervention, you've then probably got to do some sort of feasibility work and then ultimately perhaps a full trial. So you can see it's a few steps further away from patient benefit. Therefore, we're not, in terms of the money we're investing, it's the lower end of it. And we're seeing quite a few of these applications come in. About a quarter of all applications to the last round were for these tier 3, and it opens up a dynamic mix of the portfolio. We'll be seeing different types of research, so it won't just be full trials and feasibility studies. We will be seeing some developmental work, which is critical and crucial, and it also covers a part of the NIHR which wasn't well covered in the past. We would hear researchers come to us and say, I want to develop an idea, I've got a good idea, and you couldn't get funding from any of the other programs, including RFPB, so hopefully this is appealing to researchers there. I guess it fills one of the cracks in the NIHR which was previously in existence. So one of the other problems, or one of the other issues, was RFPB. It's a big administratively burdensome program. It's had 10 panels. We've now got them down to 8. Really, some of the smaller regions, the supply of applications wasn't coming through. We didn't need the capacity to assess, so we've made a few savings in terms of the administration. So you can see London isn't affected at all here, so it's mainly southeast coast and south central, Yorkshire and Humber and northeast. You can see they're very imaginatively named new regions. We were struggling to come up with some names. We looked at Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and Northumbria kind of worked for Yorkshire. I'm not sure what Yorkshire would have felt of that, so we went for the very simple in the end. But that's the funding landscape that we have now within the RFPB programme. So another thing, the programme isn't necessarily kind to new investigators, allegedly. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but this is our view on new investigators. So they are encouraged to apply. It's quite clear in our guidance. We're happy to have new investigators. The panels are instructed to assess the team as a whole. So if the lead applicant is relatively junior in experience, provided there's support in the team, and it's a convincing team that's likely to deliver the research, then that's absolutely fine. One piece of advice I would suggest here is what I see. I would suggest it's better to have perhaps one person with more substantial time commitment to help mentor or support the lead applicant, rather than finding 4 or 5 illustrious professors at 1%. 1% I think works out about 20 minutes of time, and I think panels are unsure how much work you can do, particularly for a new applicant, within 20 minutes a week. So that's probably the advice from what I hear around the panels. But ultimately, new investigators very welcome to apply. RFPB is also about capacity building. The researchers in the future, they're probably going to get their first grant from somewhere like RFPB. I suggest it's unlikely new investigators may come out of something like the research fellowship scheme from TCC and go on to get a £2 million programme grant as their first grant. They may well do. I suggest it's unlikely. And even when you think back to the 3 tiers, they don't even have to come to RFPB for a £300,000 trial. Come back, £100,000, £50,000, develop something, that's absolutely fine. So we do encourage new investigators. They're the future HTA and programme grant applicants. Probably the biggest change to the programme, which is to address the issue of the burden of applying, which the programme fully was sympathetic towards. We appreciate it was a lot of effort to put in an application for only £350,000, although it was a relatively large amount. Compared to £1 million grants, you ultimately had to fill out the same form. So what we've done is introduced this 2-stage process. The first stage is very it's a simple version of the form, so pared down just to have a look at the key questions, and then applicants will get some feedback there. And then if applicants are invited to stage 2, they have a chance to fill out the rest of the form, and I'll talk a bit more about success rates. Hopefully the chances of success at stage 2 will appeal, and applicants will be happy to fill out a bit more of the form. Excuse me. So at stage 1, we're literally asking what's the research team, what's the reason, why is this an important question, what's the actual research question, and what are the methods. That's really all we're looking at stage 1. That's the key criteria which panel members will be looking to decide, do we want to see it or not. And ultimately, if the question's relevant and the methods are okay, it's probably likely to go through to stage 2. If it's methodologically flawed or the question's not particularly relevant, then that's the sort of thing which will go out at stage 1. And also, the panel will be looking at what can be done to improve it, because sometimes there's some reasonable work or reasonable ideas and applications, but there's so many things wrong with them, it's probably easier to come back as a new submission. So that's really what's going on at stage 1, and Richard will talk a bit more about the assessment at stage 1 later on. Stage 2, so if you get through to stage 2, you've got a reasonable chance of success. So basically the form will copy over, your stage 1 application will copy over to stage 2, and then we're giving applicants 6 weeks to complete the rest of the application form. One thing we did send out an initial outcome, so I don't know if there's any applicants in the room. We'd have told you before you're in or you're out at stage 2, and then we'll give you the feedback later. So we appreciate this is a reasonably tight time frame, but ultimately this is the time frame that works in terms of the meetings we've set up, and we're assessing those stage 2s with external peer reviews too, and that's when the panel will be making a decision on whether to fund the applications or not. Just a quick outline of the timetable. So we've just had the stage 1 assessments in January. So the stage 2s, we've sent the outcome to those last week. So again, if there's any applicants in the room and you're invited to stage 2, you'd have had that feedback by now, and you're currently be filling out the application form to be submitted. Also, one other thing, a good thing which hopefully applicants will appreciate is we're always open now. So if you get that eureka moment at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can open up a form, and chances are you can carry on with your application. Because in the past we had a call, it closed, there was a big gap, and then another one would open. Whereas now we're open for about 50 weeks of the year, so you can always apply it whenever. And the Comp29, the next competition, that's open now, the stage 1s, and the call closes the end of next month. So even if you were declined at stage 1 from the previous competition, it's a lot quicker. The whole point is this facilitates the application process. It's a lot less cumbersome than it perhaps was. So the timeframes are much better for applicants, we feel, and it's much more easier to apply. And we'll be assessing both the stage 2s from competition 28 and the stage 1s from competition 29 in May. So we're kind of halfway through the new process, so I thought I'd give a bit of reflection on how we think it's going so far. So all of the meetings occurred in January, and about 8 applications on average were invited to stage 2. So what we were trying to do is achieve a success rate at stage 2 of about 50%. So we thought applicants, we're asking the stage 2 people that have been invited, fill out more of the form, spend some more time, but you've essentially got a 1 in 2 chance before you even submit. Hopefully those types of odds will appeal to applicants, and they won't mind filling out more of the form. But ultimately what we want to avoid is putting a large amount of applications through the whole process, all of the external peer review, when ultimately we can only fund a certain amount of applications regardless of how many we actually receive. And those people who would never have been funded under the old system, they've been triaged out a bit earlier at stage 1. They've got some feedback. They found out within 2 months from application submission to application outcome, whereas under the old system they'd have had to wait 8 months. So hopefully it just speeds the whole thing up, whether those applicants decide to come back in again at stage 1 or put the idea aside and come up with something else. It's really about making the whole process a lot more quicker for everyone involved. Panel members, maybe Richard can talk a bit more about this later. It seems to have been well received, so applicants, we got feedback saying it was quicker. You still need to put quite a bit of work in, but it's quicker. They appreciated that you didn't have to fill out all the extra bits of the form at stage 1, which weren't really useful in terms of knowing whether the application is likely to be funded or not. The panel members seemed to be quite well receptive to it, so it was just a new thing. I guess after doing the same thing 27 times in a row, to do it differently for the 28th is always difficult to get people on board with that. But I feel the panel members have received this quite well. And I guess the real test will be May, where we assess both the stage 1 and stage 2. So it'd be interesting to hear feedback from applicants and panel members back in May. And this is where I'll pass over to Richard, who will hopefully give you some hints on how to put in a goods application.
Thank you very much. So my name's Richard Watt, and I am the current chair of the London panel, and I've been doing that for almost 2 years. The other thing is I previously was a member of the panel as well, which I think was helpful, but possibly most importantly, I'm also someone that applies for the grants, and I've applied for RFP grants and been rejected, and also applied and been successful. So I think I've got experience from sort of both sides of the fence, so to speak. So what I'd like to do now is to go through some of the sort of general principles and insights into the application process, and also give you some insights into the panel, how they work, etc., etc. And a lot of this, I think, is fairly straightforward and fairly obvious. A lot of the information is in the website that exists with a lot of useful feedback. But again, hopefully we can have a discussion and talk through some of the issues that might need more explanation as we go along. So I suppose linked to what David said at the beginning, firstly, in terms of thinking why would you apply to the RFPB programme, what is the particular remit of that? That is clear, and you need to think through why would you go there rather than, say, the HTE or somewhere else. One point I would stress from the very beginning is the panel, the nature of RFPB is that it is a very broad range of different types of research that comes in from a range of different clinical specialties, and the panel is comprised of a very diverse range of people from different clinical backgrounds and different methodological and research backgrounds. So we have qualitative researchers, we have health economists, we have trials people, and a range of people, as I say, from different specialties. So any application that comes in will be assessed by that broad range of people, so you cannot assume the people reading your application in terms of the panels will have expert knowledge of your field, so you cannot make those assumptions when the panel is so diverse. So these are just some points in terms of knowing your targets in terms of the RFPB. The information is provided very succinctly and clearly on the website. And I think what also is useful is the examples of previous awards that have been funded, and the nature of those studies I think also is helpful to give you a sense of the types of research that fits into this particular programme. This slide is just mapping out from the very beginning of competition 1 up to competition 28 the number of applications that have been submitted to RFPB. And certainly as I was a member almost at the very beginning of this particular area, there was a huge number of applications that were coming in. Things then slightly tailed off, but as you can see from competition 27 onwards, there's a fairly steep increase again in the number of applications coming in. Now, obviously, London, as a centre of excellence with so many higher education institutions and acute trusts and other hospital settings, has a large number of applications that come in. So, as a panel, we are certainly very busy looking at our whole range of different applications, whereas, as Ben's mentioned, some of the other parts of the country had a fewer number of applications. In London, we certainly are kept busy with the volume of applications that are submitted. Now, this will just give a bit more detail from, again, what Ben mentioned is looking at success rates over the different competition from 1 up to 27. And the overarching figure is 22% of applications are successful. But the point Ben also mentioned is in London, that is 24%. Because I've heard on the sort of grapevine, the sort of gossip, that the London committee is more difficult than any other committee. Well, that's just not true. The evidence is the London committee is very similar to other parts of the country, and actual fact is slightly better. So I would not defend, is not the correct word, but the London committee is very fair in their assessment of applications, and the vast majority of us on that committee are researchers ourselves, who go through this process. So the idea and importance of giving constructive feedback, helping people, it's not about being negative and destructive, it's about helping people move forward. And in London, as I say, our success rates are higher than the national average at 24%. Now this slide, which you may not be able, well, you probably can read at the back, is just a summary of the different types of applications in terms of their nature or discipline or disciplinary background. And you can see there really is an enormous variation in types of applications that come in. Mental health sciences are probably the largest, about 20% of applications come from mental health sciences. But apart from that, the diversity is really a complete mix. So as a panel member, you certainly have to read things that are outside your area of expertise, which is very interesting and very stimulating, but certainly there's no priority given to one particular field. It really is across the spectrum. And I think the main point that we'll keep on mentioning as we go through this afternoon is it's really the quality of the methodology and the research design and research team that is the fundamental ingredient for success. The areas in which you come from, as long as you can demonstrate their significance to the NHS, their potential benefit to patients and the public, that is the key trick. And as you can see, different areas of clinical practice can fit into that very well. This is just some examples of completed projects. So on the website, there are these summaries of different completed projects, and this is to illustrate the three different types of applications that go through. So the developmental type studies, the feasibility studies, and the trials. So these are just examples of different completed projects that have been moved on in terms of dissemination and publication. And I think I've heard David Armstrong mention this. A very good example is the trial that was published in The Lancet around a relatively simple intervention around breathing. I can't exactly remember the details, but it was an innovative intervention that was evaluated in a randomized controlled trial and then published, in this case, The Lancet, to illustrate that that is one sort of top-end example of projects, but there are a complete range of different projects that have been completed and then, depending on the results, disseminated in different ways. But I think it's worthwhile as an applicant to look at these examples to give yourself an indication of the types of things that have been successful. In terms of things to keep in mind as you're drafting your application, what I would say is that the system is rigorous, the system is fair, and it is very detailed in terms of the assessment process everything goes through. Now, we'll talk a minute in detail about the stage one, but certainly in terms of the NHS support costs, treatment costs, NHS excess treatment costs, those types of things are going to be covered in stage two applications. What I would say most definitely is you need to get guidance from your R&D trust on the costings issue, because that is something that's important, and for many of us we find it quite confusing, but to get support and guidance on how you cost out the research costs versus the support costs and treatment costs is important, because that will be considered in terms of the totality of the application at stage two. Another important issue is patient and public involvement. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room realises that NIHR very much focuses and values on the importance of involving patients in the whole process of research, as does the RFPB programme. And again, in the stage one, stage two applications, the PPI really should be embedded in your design of your study. To do the research correctly, the PPI component needs to be thought through and planned at the very beginning of your application. Another relative recent development is these plain English summaries, which for those of us from a scientific and clinical background, you think it's easy to write your science in plain English. Well, it often isn't easy at all. And one of the recommendations is that you should get help from a PPI member of your team to help you draft and craft the plain English summary, because that is a very important part of the application that all of us will read, because that's something that is accessible, if it's written properly, to really explain the nature of what you're doing. Of fundamental importance, obviously, is the relevance of what your project is about in terms to patients and the NHS, and that is where you need to explain the detail in the justification of your project. What is the relevance to the NHS? How is this project going to help to improve patient outcomes, patient care, ultimately health outcomes? Another reflection is, as I think Ben and David have both mentioned, there are quite a few feasibility studies that go through the RFPB programme, and that makes a lot of sense. But what is fundamentally important, if it is a feasibility study, you need to design and describe the methodology that is appropriate for a feasibility study. So that may be looking at testing out the methodology in terms of engagement with clinicians, recruitment strategies for your patient population, measurement of outcomes, etc., etc. Now, I personally find very valuable the guidance that NIHR now provides to clarify what the purpose of feasibility studies are, in contrast to pilot studies, in contrast to full-scale randomized control trials. And just one hint, the deadlines are apparently 1 o'clock, not 5 o'clock, so you need to be careful of that, which is fairly obvious. This is the slide about costs. Now, I suspect many of us in this room do find the costings quite confusing, and sometimes there is quite a lot of debates whether it's a treatment cost or a research cost. That's why I would really recommend very strongly that you, early on in your process of preparing an application, is speak to your R&D office and the people in the finance section to give you that guidance on the different parts of the costing process. Now, in stage 1 of the application, you do not need to provide a detailed breakdown of the costs. That's not required. You just need to give an indication whether it's 150, 250 or 350. But if you get to the stage 2, you would then need, in the standard fashion, provided background detail to your costings. And in this slide, it just gives a summary, which again is in the guidance notes in the application, about separating out the research costs, which are really the cost of conducting the research, of undertaking the research, the NHS support costs, which are the costs to the NHS of supporting the research when it's ongoing, and then the treatment costs and the excess treatment costs, which again, sometimes it's more difficult to work out exact details, but those have to be covered by, not by the research costs, but by other sources, other trusts or other income sources. In terms of sort of reflections on the common areas of feedback that applications get, we've got here a list of those. What I would probably say in my experience is that the areas of feedback that most often people get, that most commonly are occurring, are things such as the clarity of the aims and objectives of your application. In the section on aims and objectives, I can't remember the exact number of words, but it's you've got space to really explain in clear terms the aim, the overall aim, and then the specific objectives. In some cases, you may have a hypothesis, but it really needs to be a cohesive and tight set of aims and objectives directly relevant to the problem you've identified in the justification section. Another important point is the methodological detail. Now, all of us struggle to describe the study when you've got a limited number of words in the applications. So it's really about being succinct, but as clear as you possibly can to describe the methodology linked to your aims and objectives. And in some cases, people really don't explain the methodology in sufficient detail or present a methodology that is not appropriate to the research question and aims and objectives they've described. Another area of feedback is the nature of the teams that are putting the application together. The best quality applications, and this is an obvious statement, come where there's a real broad range of people amongst the team. So you've got clinical expertise and you've got methodological expertise. So if you are conducting qualitative research, who is the qualitative researcher with that level of experience? If you're looking into health economic outcomes, have you got a health economist on your team or not? So it's really matching the nature of the team as best as you can to the methodology and, again, the aims and objectives of your application. And a particular issue is if you're doing analysis, statistically, have you got appropriate statistical support that is described and costed in appropriately? Now, I know the difficulties of getting all these costs in when the amounts of money is relatively modest, and that's where you have to think about the most important members of your team. And then the other point is the evidence, as we've mentioned before, the PPI input. Now, in some applications, there may be a PPI co-applicant, if that's appropriate, but what is absolutely essential is that the PPI component is embedded throughout the methodological detail and application. It's not just a cursory tick box process, it's actually been properly considered in terms of PPI input. Now, this is just a summary of, a quantitative summary of the feedback applicants have been given, presumably nationally across the whole programme, and you can just see that in terms of numerically the types of things that come up, most common are such things as the detail in the methodology, the nature of the team, recruitment, presumably of patients, design, appropriateness of design, etc., etc. So I suppose the message for all of us is to think, how can we demonstrate our understanding and expertise to a panel and ultimately to expert peer reviewers on those types of details of the methodology, the nature of the team, etc. So covered some of this, but possible reasons for failure. To my understanding and experience, the real reasons for failure are things such as applications being rushed, where there's lots of spelling errors or formatting mistakes or referencing systems that are not clearly worked through. It's evidence of a rushed application, which also normally doesn't come together and fit together as a cohesive document that justifies the nature of the methodology. And then the other issues, as we can see, are not so much now out of scope. That was a problem before, but I think maybe Ben's mentioned, that now is less of a problem. People tend not to be out of scope because the description has been improved and is perhaps more clear. The demonstration of the trajectory to patient benefit, now that can sometimes be quite tricky, but that's about justifying either public health significance or the clinical significance of the topic and demonstrating how ultimately patient benefit will be covered, but that still is an issue that can be problematic. The aims and objectives, if they're ill-defined, poorly written, poorly crafted, those are things that take time to do properly, and if they're done badly, it confuses all of us in terms of the purpose of the proposed research. Omission of critical literature. Well, not all topics have Cochrane systematic reviews, etc., but certainly in stage 2, when experts will review the application, if you've missed out some fundamental studies in that particular area of research, that does not suggest that you're on top of the literature and really knowledgeable of the topic. So therefore, it's very important to summarise the literature with the most up-to-date, high-quality evidence that exists. And I think the other points I've mentioned, really. One other point maybe just to highlight is being over-ambitious with your research plan. If it is a 2 or 3 year study, what is feasible within that timescale? Have you got a Gantt chart that really explains the different milestones, and are those issues feasible in terms of timescale? So one potential problem may be recruitment strategies. Will you really be able to recruit X number of patients within that 1 month, 2 month, 3 month period? Do you have any previous data to explain how that is going to be feasible? Things like that often can help. This is the plain English summaries. Again, this is something that's been launched from May 2014, so this is now the case for all NIHR applications, and it is a very important thing. And I would not underestimate the difficulty of writing a good plain English summary, because many of us, when we're in our own areas of expertise, write something, but is it understandable? Can it be communicated sufficiently to people outside your field of interest? So spending time on this is really an important investment, because often, in terms of application assessment, people will be looking at this probably first to get a really good sense of the application, and then we'll be looking at other parts. So don't leave this part to the very end and assume it's the easy, quick thing. I think this takes time to do properly. And there are good links on drafting plain English summaries. Peter, are people getting these slides? Yeah, so these slides, you can get these slides and you'll see the links, etc. And maybe just to finish off, so as we've heard, we've now got this new stage 1 and stage 2 assessment. So we had the first meeting of our panel in January looking at the stage 1 applications. And I think what we've all learned from that process is the stage 1 application, what you've really got to try and do in that very short number of sections is demonstrate the significance and relevance and importance of the area of interest, and then really very carefully draft the aims and objectives and the methodology to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of the methodology that's most appropriate. So what we're really looking at is the justification for the problem, the clarity of the aims and objectives, and then the appropriateness of the methodology to answer the question that's been specified. And again, as Ben's mentioned, there's these different 3 types of studies, each of which will be slightly different in how you describe them, but that stage 1 process, that's ultimately what we're looking for, is the justification, the clarification and clarity of the aims and objectives, and then in particular the appropriateness of the methodology. Peter and colleagues have organised this, so, and I think the very important thing is that there are experts in London, in the RDS, that are here to help you and to guide you through the process. I think we're all trying to work together to ensure that we have a similar understanding of the different issues, and these RDS people are really there to help and to give that support. And certainly myself and my colleagues have benefited enormously from getting RDS support on a range of applications. So we can't force you to do that, but the benefits for the quality of the applications, I think, is significant if you spend time meeting with the RDS and have sufficient time to make changes and have a dialogue with the RDS colleagues rather than doing something at the very last minute when they'll probably be unable to give you the sort of detailed support and guidance that you might need. And I think what we're trying to do is link better in terms of communication, particularly in stage 1 and stage 2, so that it's a more sort of cohesive level of support, the feedback we can give, and then the RDS colleagues trying to support you. So that is just the link, as I'm sure you've all seen, but the resources on the website really have been designed very carefully, and I would really recommend you spend a lot of time reading those and rereading them to be absolutely clear on the guidance. So I think we're probably going to continue and then we'll have questions afterwards.
Thank you, Richard and Ben. We can probably just pause for a few minutes and take a couple of questions now. People have any questions? Yep.
You wouldn't necessarily be, in stage 2 definitely, that would be very important. In stage 1 not necessarily. I think sometimes people can embed some of those, but a full Gantt chart is definitely for stage 2 because that really helps just to visually map out the different stages with the time frames, etc. So for stage 2 it's an essential thing, I would say. Thank you. This is Brian, who's one of the surgeons on our panel, by the way, so it's like an inside question. I think the important point, as I understand it, is the question was whether clinical trials units should be incorporated into applications or not, clarifications on that. From my understanding, with applications for full trials with HTA and other places, you would have to have a clinical trials unit within your team. That would be sort of mandatory or strongly recommended. With trials within RFPB, from my experience, most clinical trials units would not want to get involved in a relatively small scale trial because the costings often are beyond the 350 ceiling. So I don't think we would expect a clinical trials automatically to be involved, clinical trials unit automatically involved. What we would expect is a statistician or a member of the co-applicant with experience of trials, not necessarily a full clinical trials unit costed in. I think there's one more question.
Just a general question. Does the NIHR support practice-based research or only randomized trials?
Did everyone hear that question? So the question is, does NIHR support practice-based research or just clinical trials? NIHR most definitely does support practice-based research as well. So applications for this type of program could often be within a practice-based, either primary care practice setting, and also the health services and what's other health services research call. There's a separate wing where a lot of the practice-based research is also funded. So it most definitely does include practice-based research.